Atheists should really stay away, in my opinion, from using the Galileo story somehow to show that the church is against scientific advancement or something like that. That's definitely not true.
One concerning the difference between, say, belief in God as motivating your scientific enterprise and Christianity as a world religion. Because when I think about someone like Galileo, an important founder of the scientific method, and I think about the way that he's treated by the reigning Catholic authorities for presenting an alternate view of the world, although not proving it, arguably, at the time, running into a bit of trouble and ending up finishing his life in house arrest in Tuscany.
Rather luxurious house
arrest.
Yeah,
he got it quite well. I think this idea that he was tortured for his beliefs is a mistaken one, although allegedly some people believe that he was shown the instruments of torture, as if to say,
that could be.
Keep quiet.
Here again, I think that using Galileo as an example doesn't work, because if you look at what actually happened, the first people to criticize Galileo was not the Catholic Church. It was the philosophers who were building on Aristotle and believed in a fixed earth. And the church got involved rather foolishly because it had climbed on the Aristotelian bandwagon.
Yes.
So you could argue that this is not really science versus Christianity, because Galileo was a Christian. He believed in God before he started all this and when he finished. So I think I would agree with the historians of science that say that the Galileo incident is not really one to be used to show that there's a huge conflict between science and religion.
The amount of times in American universities you hear this example of Galileo and the church persecuting Galileo. I took a astronomy class, and I remember my astronomy professor brought it up, and I was like, bad example. It shows that you have caught on to this caricature of a story that historians don't necessarily agree about, that somehow Galileo came up with his ideas and the church was like, what are you talking about, and freaking out, and then they persecuted him and stuff like that. Galileo never gave up his faith in God. And there's lots of politics behind this, you guys. There's a lot of politics behind the whole story with Galileo. He offended people. He's just kind of foolish about the way he goes about things. He's offending people. There's promises made, promises not kept. It results in something, but also it's not, this is church doctrine. There's a popular theory of the time, which is Aristotelian in its origins, and everybody was an Aristotelian. And this was rocking the Aristotelian framework. Suppose the modern theory of physics, and then there's some serious discoveries made, and it's made by a Christian individual. Suppose the church has a position on this stuff, and there's a Christian guy who comes out and is very critical of it and has the research to back it up and says, look, idealism is the case. And then gets persecuted for it from the scientific community because he's just rocking everything. And then later on it ends up being a story about like, oh, the church persecuted this guy. It's like, no, kind of rock the scientific foundations and the assumptions of people. And so therefore, that's not really the church's issue. Even though the church was involved in this, there's too many kind of human-to-human dynamics there of offending people getting offended, people being in power and getting offended, and then you're punished for it, where it results. You know, it's a caricature of a story, and it's a really bad one. Atheists should really stay away, in my opinion, from using the Galileo story somehow to show that the church is against scientific advancement or something like that. That's definitely not true.
There was some dispute over what he was allowed to do, and so he writes this philosophical dialogue where he's like, well, I'm not writing an essay in favor of heliocentrism. I'm writing a dialogue. It's just that the character that disagrees with me is called the fool, and that's what finally did it seems, for the church. For me, I think you're right to say that this isn't a good indication of the conflict between science and religious belief. For me, at best, with the most sort of uncharitable view of the Catholic practice here, it might show a conflict between, say, the scientific method of Galileo and the Catholic Church.
I think that's fair enough. And if you look at various times in church history, I would say that to their shame, and as in the Galileo case, it was only in my lifetime that the Catholic Church rehabilitated Galileo.
Yes.
And that's pretty shameful.
Finally said that he was correct.
Yes. And the same is true, I suppose, of the so-called conflict between Huxley and Wilberforce, after Darwin.
Yes,
that's represented as
this is a debate that happens just down the road at the Natural History Museum
here, the Natural History
in Oxford,
Museum.
And it's between Thomas Huxley, who is a sort of protege of Charles Darwin.
Yes.
And so the newly discovered idea of natural selection is being defended by Huxley, and then you've got the Bishop Wilberforce, who is arguing against it. And this is again seen as archetypal science, evolution, undeniable fact, versus the
that's right.
The priest that can't accept it.
But it's very interesting. I've read the whole debate, and I find that many people haven't. And Wilberforce was the kind of cleric who was an amateur scientist, and he seemed to have a lot of leisure for doing that, which might tell us something about the church in those days.
Right.
And Huxley was dead against this. He wanted a professional class of scientists. That's the first. There was a strong bias against it. But when it came to the argument, I was fascinated to discover that very early on in his speech, Wilberforce said, I am not going to use religious arguments. I am only going to discuss the science. That's often left completely out of the discussion. And again, it was, what was his name? The professor of the history of science at the Open University said that this event should not be used to drive a wedge between science and Christianity. It was a much more complex thing. It was a sociological thing as well. The push to have professional scientists, get rid of the clerics, turn the churches into temples to Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, and all this kind of stuff. There was much more going on than simply dealing with science. But poor old Wilberforce, I think he gets the rough end of the stick, and it's not always very accurate.